The night was unnaturally silent, broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing against sterile hospital walls. Jonathan's breath grew heavy as his name echoed through the corridor, a nurse whispering like fate itself had spoken. He pushed open the door, his chest tight, expecting nothing, yet greeted by the piercing cry of a baby, raw and unrelenting. The sound clawed through his heart, shredding the fragile illusion of normalcy he had carried. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows that made the room feel like a stage set for tragedy. Jonathan said, "This cannot be happening." His hands trembled, gripping the doorframe as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. A nurse's eyes met his, pity etched in her weary gaze, her lips forming words too heavy to carry. She whispered, "Jonathan, this child is yours." His heart dropped, as though gravity had doubled its weight, crushing every ounce of denial within him. A baby's cry surged louder, filling the sterile air, echoing as judgment, as prophecy, as chains. Jonathan staggered closer, his soul resisting the truth, his voice cracking. Jonathan said, "No, I don't even know her." His mind raced, fragments of memory and loss colliding, unable to stitch together the why or the how. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath him wavered. In that moment, Jonathan knew his life had been rewritten without permission, without warning, carved in the cry of a newborn. Jonathan's breath came ragged as silence followed the cry, broken only by the soft hum of machines. He clenched his fists, rage clashing with terror. Jonathan said, "I never asked for this." The nurse placed the child gently into his arms, the weight shocking him. His chest constricted as warmth seeped into his skin, alien and binding. Memories of abandonment clawed up, a childhood spent in shadows, a father who vanished, a mother who whispered apologies as she faded into nothing. Jonathan's voice cracked. Jonathan said, "I can't be him, I can't." Yet the baby's small fingers wrapped around his thumb, fragile strength binding him in place. The room blurred, grief swallowing his vision. The nurse said, "The mother's last words were for you." His stomach twisted, denial battling truth. The child's tiny cry softened, as if sensing the storm in his chest. Jonathan staggered, heart torn between fleeing and surrendering, as the world tilted violently around him. The air thickened with unbearable weight, every breath Jonathan took grinding against his ribs. He remembered the last time he heard his mother speak, her whisper on her deathbed, fragile yet heavy with love and regret. Jonathan said, "Why now?" The baby's warmth anchored him, pulling him away from his own drowning memories. Shadows flickered along the wall, reflections of ghosts he had tried to bury. The nurse's voice broke into his thoughts, steady but cutting. Nurse said, "She trusted you." His throat burned, bile rising as he shook his head violently. Jonathan said, "No, I was never meant for this." The baby stirred, eyes barely opening, fragile innocence staring back at him. That gaze sliced him deeper than any accusation, revealing truths he feared to admit. The hum of fluorescent lights became a roar, pressing against his skull, every second louder than the last. He wanted to escape, but the child's presence rooted him like chains. Jonathan's legs weakened as he slumped into the nearest chair, the baby pressed against him. His thoughts screamed of betrayal and abandonment, yet the warmth in his arms silenced every lie he wanted to believe. Jonathan said, "What did she want from me?" The nurse lowered her gaze, unable to answer, as silence fell heavy. The baby let out a soft coo, a fragile reminder of life amidst despair. Jonathan shook his head, rage surfacing. Jonathan said, "I am not ready for this. I cannot carry this weight." But even as he spoke, the child's presence contradicted his words, tiny breaths pressing against his chest, demanding an answer his heart refused to form. The chair creaked under his trembling frame, the sterile walls pressing closer, each second narrowing his escape. The nurse finally spoke, her voice low, carrying the weight of the mother's last request. Nurse said, "She wanted you to know. She believed you could love her child as no one else could." Jonathan's heart cracked at the words, fury and sorrow colliding in his chest. He remembered his own mother whispering promises she never kept, words now echoing like curses. He stared down at the fragile face in his arms, torn between rage and awe. Jonathan said, "I cannot love what I never asked for." The baby stirred, fragile breath against his chest, as though answering his denial. The silence after was unbearable, a storm waiting to break. Jonathan's tears fell unbidden, his soul unraveling as the truth bound itself to him, whether he chose it or not. Jonathan sat in the hospital chair long after the nurse had left, the child's faint breathing rising against his chest. He stared into the distance, his thoughts clawing through old wounds. Jonathan said, "This is not my story. I was never meant to carry someone else's scars." His mind drifted to memories of his father walking out the door, leaving silence as inheritance. The weight of abandonment pressed in, making every heartbeat an echo of betrayal. Jonathan whispered, "I swore I would never repeat him." The child's small hand gripped his shirt, fragile yet unyielding, pulling him into a role he was not ready to accept. The walls of the hospital seemed to narrow, pushing him inward, forcing him to see himself in this tiny reflection of hope and burden. Shadows of fear, shame, and longing warred inside him, stripping him bare. He closed his eyes, a single tear breaking through. Jonathan said, "If this is what she wanted of me, I cannot walk away." Jonathan rose to his feet, pacing the room, the baby's cries soft but persistent. He felt the walls tremble with ghosts, the echo of his mother's frail voice whispering love she could not give. Jonathan said, "Why did she trust me? I was never strong enough." The nurse entered again, placing quiet hands on the bed. Nurse said, "Because she knew your wounds would teach you how to protect him." Jonathan shook his head violently, denial sharp in his chest. Jonathan said, "No, wounds only bleed, they don't heal anyone." The baby's cries softened as though silencing his excuses, pulling his soul into the present. He froze, realizing every step backward still left the child in his arms. His anger collapsed into silence, replaced by trembling resolve he did not yet understand. The baby's tiny face stirred Jonathan's buried fears. He remembered his childhood bedroom, wallpaper peeling nights of hunger, a mother's hollow apologies. Jonathan said, "I know nothing about love." Yet the child's soft coo answered with innocence untainted by betrayal. His hands shook, remembering how his father never returned, how absence carved its mark into every day. The baby turned slightly, fragile breath brushing against his skin, tethering him to a choice he could not escape. Jonathan said, "I will break him if I try." His voice cracked as tears welled, streaming silently down his cheeks. The nurse's eyes softened, but she said nothing, allowing his war to rage aloud. In that silence, Jonathan's heart betrayed his mind, clinging tighter to the fragile weight in his arms. Jonathan stepped closer to the window, morning light spilling through blinds across his trembling face. He whispered, as though confessing to the glass. Jonathan said, "I swore I would never be like him, but I don't know how to be better." The baby stirred, tiny breath fogging against his shirt, grounding him in a present he wanted to deny. The nurse finally spoke, quiet, yet firm. Nurse said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to stay." Jonathan's heart clenched at the words, his father's absence roaring back like a curse. He pressed his forehead to the glass, the city below still asleep, unaware his world had already shifted forever. He whispered again, softer this time. Jonathan said, "I don't know if I can." Yet his arms refused to let go. The silence in the room grew heavy, but inside Jonathan's chest, the war raged louder. He remembered every night he begged for someone to stay, and every morning he woke to absence. He stared at the baby's face, fragile and trusting, and it gutted him. Jonathan said, "If I walk away, he will know the same emptiness I lived." The nurse's eyes glistened, her silence saying more than words could. The baby's tiny hand curled against his shirt, anchoring him like chains made of hope. Jonathan's tears fell freely, soaking into the child's blanket, his soul unraveling. He whispered, Jonathan said, "I don't know how to love, but I will try." The room felt different now. the air still heavy, but no longer suffocating. For the first time, he did not feel alone. Jonathan walked into his mother's old house, the baby bundled in his arms, silence pressing heavy on the walls. The familiar scent of dust and faded memories clawed at him. His sister Emily stood near the fireplace, eyes sharp with judgment. Emily said, "You think you can raise him? You could barely hold yourself together." Jonathan's chest tightened, her words echoing truths he already feared. He shook his head slowly, eyes flashing with frustration. Jonathan said, "I didn't choose this, but I won't abandon him." Emily's gaze hardened, lips curling with disbelief. Emily said, "This family doesn't need another failure." Rage flared inside him, yet the baby's soft whimper silenced his retort, grounding him in fragile duty. The house groaned under the weight of unspoken grief, generations of broken promises lingering like ghosts. Jonathan whispered, "I will not be him," though his voice trembled with doubt. The storm of rejection had only begun. Jonathan stood stiffly as Emily's words burned. Emily said, "Do you even know what that child needs? He'll starve under your care." His jaw clenched, fury crawling up his throat. Jonathan said, "I may not know, but I will learn." Emily scoffed, shaking her head. Emily said, "You're too late for redemption." The baby stirred, releasing a fragile cry that cut through the venom. Jonathan's eyes softened, the child's innocence silencing the war for a moment. He whispered, "Jonathan said, he deserves better than what we had." Emily's face faltered, her mask cracking before she turned away, unwilling to show weakness. The silence that followed screamed louder than her judgment, pressing Jonathan deeper into isolation. Jonathan stepped outside, cold wind cutting across the porch. Neighbors gathered on the street, whispers carried like daggers through the evening air. A man muttered, "That's his child, poor thing." A woman hissed, "He'll ruin the baby, just like his father ruined him." Jonathan's stomach twisted, their voices branding him with shame. He clenched his jaw, shielding the baby closer, their breath mingling in the cold night. Jonathan said, "They don't matter." Yet inside the words felt hollow. His knees weakened as their stares pierced his soul, judgment too heavy to bear. He whispered to the child. Jonathan said, "I will not let them define us." But even as he spoke, he doubted every promise he made. Later that night, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. The baby slept beside him in a makeshift crib, breath soft and steady. The silence magnified the storm inside him. He whispered. Jonathan said, "How do I fight when I am already broken?" Memories of rejection pressed in, friends who had turned away, lovers who had left. He saw in every betrayal the same verdict, unworthy. Tears welled as he glanced at the baby's face, serene and trusting. Jonathan said, "I can't fail him the way they failed me." The words burned like both promise and curse, binding him in chains of expectation. His fists clenched on the table, wood creaking beneath the pressure of his doubt. The following morning, Jonathan's former partner Sarah appeared at the doorway, eyes cold as steel. Sarah said, "You think you can raise him? You couldn't even hold on to us." Jonathan froze, her voice cutting deeper than any neighbor's whispers. His throat tightened, memories of their broken past colliding with the fragile present. He whispered. Jonathan said, "I never asked for this, but I will not abandon him." Sarah's lips twisted in bitter scorn. Sarah said, "This isn't about you. This is about what you'll destroy." The baby stirred as if sensing the storm, soft cries filling the room. Jonathan's chest heaved as he drew the child close, his voice trembling. Jonathan said, "I will not let him live in the ruins we did." The words carried defiance, but behind them pulsed fear he could not silence. Jonathan sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the baby asleep in the crib beside him. His sister Emily entered, her face pale, her eyes carrying a secret too heavy to keep. Emily said, "Jonathan, there's something you don't know." He turned sharply, his body rigid with suspicion. Jonathan said, "What now? Another judgment? Another reason I'll fail?" Emily's lips quivered, her voice breaking. Emily said, The child's mother. She wasn't the one you thought. Silence fell like a blade, splitting the air. Jonathan's throat tightened, heart pounding violently as fear clawed its way in. He whispered. Jonathan said, "What are you saying?" Emily's hands trembled, her eyes filled with regret. Emily said, "She carried a secret to her grave. This baby isn't hers. He is mine." Jonathan's head spun, the world tilting violently under Emily's confession. He slammed his fist against the table, voice rising like thunder. Jonathan said, "You lied to me? You let me believe all this time?" Emily's tears fell, her voice fractured. Emily said, "I was scared. I couldn't face the shame. They would have destroyed me." His jaw clenched, the betrayal slicing through his chest deeper than any wound before. Jonathan said, "You chained me to a life that wasn't mine to carry." The baby stirred in the crib, soft cries filling the silence, amplifying the storm. Emily reached forward, desperate. Emily said, "I thought I was protecting him. I thought you were strong enough to do what I couldn't." Jonathan recoiled, his heart breaking under the weight of her truth. Jonathan staggered back, hands clutching his head as though he could crush away the truth. His voice cracked. Jonathan said, "I carried her last words like they were chains, and now you tell me they were lies?" Emily's face twisted with guilt. Emily said she wanted to protect you, Jonathan. She thought you would never forgive me. His chest rose and fell violently, fury colliding with sorrow. Jonathan whispered. Jonathan said, "You were supposed to be my sister, not my betrayer." Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling. Emily said, "I couldn't raise him. I couldn't face this alone. You are stronger than me." His laugh was hollow, bitter, like glass shattering. Jonathan said, "Strength doesn't come from lies." The baby's cries grew louder, echoing like judgment in the suffocating air. Jonathan collapsed into a chair, his breath ragged, the weight of betrayal crushing him. He stared at Emily with hollow eyes. Jonathan said, "You left me drowning in her memory while you carried the truth." Emily shook her head violently. Emily said, "I couldn't survive their scorn. You don't understand the shame." His voice thundered in response. Jonathan said, "I understand abandonment. I understand lies. And now he will too." Emily wept openly, sinking to the floor, her body shaking with regret. The baby's cries pierced through them both, raw and demanding, a reminder of the fragile life bound to their broken choices. Jonathan pressed his hands into his face, torn between rage and pity, unable to decide whether to hate her or save her. The truth lingered like poison, but Jonathan's gaze shifted to the child, innocence wrapped in swaddling cloth. He whispered. Jonathan said, "He is not mine, yet he is everything I have left." Emily's voice trembled through her sobs. Emily said, "Please, don't hate me. Don't take him from me forever." Jonathan's chest constricted, torn between rage and the fragile bond already carved in his heart. He stood slowly, lifting the baby into his arms. Jonathan said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I will not abandon him." Emily sobbed harder, her face buried in her hands. Jonathan looked at the child, his voice breaking into a vow. Jonathan said, "I will protect him, even if the truth destroys me." The night air grew colder, silence falling heavy, carrying the weight of shattered trust and reluctant devotion. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, heavy air pressing against Jonathan's chest as he stood at the center, clutching the baby close. Emily sat across from him, her face streaked with guilt, yet her eyes filled with defiance. The judge's gavel struck, silencing the storm. Judge said, "We are here to determine custody of the child." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his voice raw. Jonathan said, "He deserves truth, not lies wrapped in fear." Emily rose, her body trembling. Emily said, "I am his mother. No court can erase that." The audience gasped, murmurs rattling like chains. Jonathan's voice cracked, his soul pouring into the words. Jonathan said, "And where were you when he needed you?" "I carried the weight you abandoned." The silence that followed carried more force than any scream. The baby stirred in his arms, fragile presence binding the storm around them. The lawyer, representing Emily, stood, his voice sharp and cold. Lawyer said, "My client seeks to reclaim her rights taken in silence and shame." Jonathan's fists clenched, his body trembling. Jonathan said, "Rights abandoned are scars left on another's soul." Emily's eyes welled, but her voice rose, desperate. Emily said, "I never stopped loving him. I was just too weak to face them." The room grew tense, the baby's soft cry slicing through the thick air, forcing every head to turn. Jonathan's voice thundered. Jonathan said, "Love without presence is nothing but abandonment." His words shattered the quiet, every syllable a blade. The gavel struck again, yet the silence afterward felt more dangerous than noise. Jonathan stepped forward, his chest heaving, voice raw with years of unspoken pain. Jonathan said, "I grew up knowing what absence feels like. I will not let him live in that shadow." Emily's lips quivered, her eyes pleading. Emily said, "I can change. I can be the mother he needs." He shook his head slowly, tears burning down his face. Jonathan said, "You cannot erase the nights I fed him, the mornings I carried him through shame, the storms I faced alone." The audience murmured, the baby's soft whimper silencing them all. His vow hung heavy in the air, a blade cutting through the lies, a promise forged in fire. Emily broke into sobs, collapsing into her chair, her voice fractured. Emily said, "I thought hiding the truth would protect him. I never wanted to hurt you." Jonathan's fists trembled, but his voice carried fire. Jonathan said, "The truth was a storm, and you left me to drown in it alone." Tears blurred his vision, but his stance remained unbroken. The judge leaned forward, voice grave. Judge said, "What binds this court is not your pain, but the child's future." Silence blanketed the room, every eye fixed on the baby, sleeping in Jonathan's arms. The weight of every secret, every betrayal, hung thick in the air, demanding judgment. The gavel struck once more, thunderous in the silence. Judge said, "This court recognizes Jonathan as the guardian of the child, until such time evidence proves otherwise." Emily's sobs filled the room, her body collapsing under the verdict. Jonathan held the baby tighter, his tears falling freely, both victory and burden weighing on his soul. He whispered, Jonathan said, "I never wanted this battle, but I will not let him be lost." The room remained hushed, every spectator struck by the raw storm unfolding. Jonathan's eyes burned as he stared down at the child, whispering a vow no gavel could undo. Jonathan said, "You are not my blood, but you are my heart." The silence afterward was unshakable, a moment carved into eternity. The courthouse emptied slowly, but Jonathan remained seated, the baby asleep in his arms. The silence carried the weight of both victory and burden. His eyes drifted to Emily, slumped against the bench, her sobs now muted whispers. Jonathan said, "I never asked for this war, but I will carry its scars." Emily looked up, her face pale, regret carved deep into her eyes. Emily said, "I lost everything tonight, but maybe he won." His chest tightened, anger colliding with pity. Jonathan whispered. Jonathan said, "You could have stood with me, but you chose to break us instead." She lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. The baby stirred softly, pulling his attention back to the fragile life entrusted to him. The world outside carried on, but Jonathan knew nothing would ever be the same. Jonathan walked through the courthouse doors into the cold night, the baby pressed close against his chest. The wind bit at his skin, carrying the faint smell of rain. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashing, their voices like daggers in the dark. Reporter shouted, "Do you think you're fit to raise him?" Jonathan's jaw tightened as he shielded the child from the lights. Jonathan said, "I may not be perfect, but I will not abandon him." The cameras kept clicking, but his words cut through the chaos. Emily emerged behind him, escorted by her lawyer, her head bowed in shame. He glanced at her once, not with hatred, but with the weight of fractured blood ties. The night stretched long, carrying both judgment and fragile hope. Back at the house, Jonathan placed the baby in the crib, the old wooden frame creaking under the weight of innocence. He sank into a chair, the silence overwhelming. His hands trembled as he whispered. Jonathan said, "How do I raise you when I was never raised myself?" His voice cracked, the shadows of his father haunting the room. The baby shifted slightly, tiny breaths filling the air with fragile rhythm. Jonathan pressed his palms against his face, torn between despair and resolve. He whispered again. Jonathan said, "I will not let you grow up waiting for someone who never comes." The vow carried no triumph, only the raw ache of necessity. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, as if the world itself tested his resolve. The following morning, sunlight streamed through thin curtains, cutting through the shadows of the night. Jonathan sat at the table, a bottle of formula in one hand, exhaustion lining his face. The baby's small cries filled the room, a rhythm both fragile and demanding. Jonathan said, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I will learn." His hands shook as he fed the child, yet a strange calm spread through him as the baby's cries softened into quiet gulps. The house that once carried only silence now pulsed with fragile life. He whispered. Jonathan said, "You deserve more than my brokenness." For the first time, he felt the faintest trace of hope, thin but unbreakable. Later that day, Jonathan carried the baby outside, standing on the porch as sunlight broke through the clouds. The wind carried the scent of rain-washed earth, crisp and alive. He stared at the horizon, chest heavy but steady. Jonathan whispered. Jonathan said, "I will never be free of the scars, but I will not let them define you." The baby stirred, pressing closer against his chest, tiny breaths soft and sure. For the first time, Jonathan felt the storm quiet within him, not gone, but no longer consuming. He whispered again. Jonathan said, "We will survive this. Together." The world stretched ahead, uncertain and unkind, but also filled with the possibility of redemption. The evening sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and sorrow. Jonathan sat on the porch, the baby cradled against his chest, silence wrapping them both in fragile stillness. His voice cracked. Jonathan said, "Everything I knew was broken. But you are the piece left to me." He remembered his mother's last whisper, her fragile voice carrying the weight of unfinished love. His chest tightened as he realized the same burden now lived inside him. Emily's shadow lingered in the doorway, her eyes red, her lips trembling as though she longed to speak yet dared not. Jonathan turned away, his gaze fixed on the child. Jonathan whispered, "You may never know peace from where you came, but you will know me." The vow left his lips like a scar sealed into eternity. Inside, the house groaned with the weight of silence. Jonathan laid the baby in the crib, shadows stretching across the wooden floor. He brushed the child's tiny hand, his voice fragile. Jonathan said, "I never wanted to be a father, but somehow, that's what I became." He remembered nights of hunger, of crying himself to sleep in the emptiness of abandonment. The ache of that void became his resolve. Jonathan whispered, "I will not let you feel the emptiness I carried." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. Emily said, "I wish I had your strength." His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't look at her. Jonathan said, "Strength doesn't erase betrayal." The words left her shaking, her silence answering with more force than any apology. Rain began to fall outside, the patter against glass echoing in the silence. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, the baby resting in his arms, asleep. He whispered. Jonathan said, "Your life will not begin in shame, no matter what they said." The rain grew heavier, drowning the world beyond the walls. Emily entered quietly, her eyes hollow, her voice barely a breath. Emily said, "I never thought the truth would destroy us like this." Jonathan shook his head, bitter laughter escaping. Jonathan said, "It wasn't the truth, it was the lies that killed us." She fell silent, her tears falling unchecked. The baby stirred softly, grounding Jonathan in a fragile sense of clarity. He whispered again. Jonathan said, "He is not my blood, but he is my salvation." The storm outside raged, lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating the fractured family within. Jonathan stood, cradling the baby, his voice shaking but firm. Jonathan said, "I cannot forgive you now, but I will not erase you either." Emily gasped softly, her tears flowing faster, her knees trembling. She whispered. Emily said, "Then let me be near him, even if I cannot be his mother in truth." His chest constricted, the fury within colliding with pity. He whispered. Jonathan said, "That choice is not mine, it is his. One day he will decide who we were to him." Lightning split the sky again, thunder rolling like judgment, while inside silence fell heavier than the storm. Morning broke with a muted gray sky. The storm washed away, but leaving silence behind. Jonathan stepped outside, the baby in his arms, the world still damp with rain. He whispered. Jonathan said, "They tried to bury you in lies, but you will grow in truth." His eyes brimmed with tears, his voice carrying both sorrow and strength. Jonathan said, "You may never call me father, but you will know who held you when no one else did." The baby shifted slightly, breathing soft against his chest. Emily remained inside, her figure framed in the doorway, a ghost of regret and longing. Jonathan turned his back to her, eyes on the horizon. His final vow cut through the silence. Jonathan said, "I will not be remembered for what I lost. I will be remembered for what I kept."